So today we're gonna focus on Jacob and Esau, and then just a little bit of Joseph. So we're gonna start actually right there at Genesis 25:21. Again, we're not going to do these verse by verse, but we will look at a little bit of this right here. We're going to do Genesis 25:21 through 28. It says, "And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is thus, why is this happening to me?' So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 'Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger.' When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak, so they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob." All right, so first of all, I'm just going to throw out there, note that it says when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Okay, so basically what it's saying there, it's not a negative thing about either one. It's like, Jacob would be the one who would be more likely to go, into college, if you will, today. Whereas Esau's the one who might just start a working or a trade or whatever. That's kind of the difference between them, the way it's described. It's not positive or negative, either one. Even though, I wouldn't want to be described as a hairy all over basically like a donkey. Because later that's basically how Jacob's going to pretend to be him, is he's going to wear donkey skins. Spoiler alert, right? All right, so first of all, you have Jacob and Esau, right? And it tells you, whenever it tells you in the Old Testament, he came out this way, or, this is the way he was, so they called him whatever. Well, that tells you that has something to do with that. And your Bible likely has a footnote, right? It'll tell you whatever those names mean. So always note. So if you'll look, if I'm not mistaken, all of your Bibles or most of your Bibles will have, you'll have your textual notes, which will have numbers, right? And then you'll have your cross-references, which will have letters. And a cross-reference is like when it has a particular passage or whatever, if that is similar to another passage somewhere else, or if it alludes to something else, you'll have that little cross-reference. And so pay attention to those in your Bibles, because oftentimes they will give you good information that you can go and look back at. So naming conventions in the Old Testament. So names often contain divine elements or said something about God. So you see this certainly in the ancient Near East, where lots of people, particularly the kings and stuff, their names would have the name of some pagan god in it. And so that would kind of associate them with that God, right? And so you have that in your name. It might give you divine, help from that God. It's like you're walking around with that God's name helping you. You also see this in Israel, right? And you see it in the Old Testament. So Isaiah, for instance, means Yahweh saves, right? Other times, names define someone's characteristics or circumstances of their birth, as here, right? So Jacob means heel grabber or deceiver, or the verb to cheat, right? But then later his name is changed to Israel, which means strives with God, or God strives, right? Because he's constantly, Jacob's thing is that he constantly wants to rely on himself for everything. He doesn't want to rely on God. And so that's why he never, and we'll talk about it later, but, he wants to give God these particular, if you'll do this and if you'll do that, then I'll serve you. Well, that's not the way that really works. Note that Abram, is also changed to Abraham. So you have that. There was also an expectation in the ancient world that the name would have the effect of making the person live up to its meaning, right? And so if you named a person a certain thing, and if it was a positive thing, then that person would, hopefully they would grow up to that. So like today, it would be like if you named your kid something that meant, like winner, well, that means that kid's going to be a winner, right? But if you named your kid loser, then that kid's going to be a loser, right? And so that's kind of the way they thought about it. It was setting kind of the destiny for that child. So since they thought that way, note that naming a child gave the namer a good bit of power, right? Because you have authority over that person's destiny because of the name that you give them, right? That's just the way they believed. I'm not saying that it literally does that, but I'm just saying that's the way they believed in the ancient world. Also, and this gets very interesting, if you knew somebody's name, like you couldn't cast spells, like they would curse people and stuff often, and you could not curse someone unless you knew their true name, right? If you knew their name, you could put a curse on them. It's like knowing someone's social security number, right? You can't really do anything unless you have their social security number, but once you have that social security number, you can do stuff. And I actually heard years ago one Egyptologist, he was talking about, and I could not find a reference to this anywhere else, but I didn't look that hard. But he said that it was, in Egypt, it was somewhat common to where kids, when they were born, they would actually be given two names. So you would get your true name when you were born, but then basically they would call you by a nickname. That way, if someone wanted to put a curse on you, they couldn't do it because they didn't actually know your true name, right? They only knew your nickname. And if you tried to use somebody's nickname, you couldn't curse somebody with just the nickname, right? So again, pretty interesting. But it definitely in Egypt and Sumer, you have literature where it talks about true names and casting spells on people with their true names and all of that kind of stuff. All right, so then we get to Genesis 25, 29 through 34, where Jacob steals Esau's birthright, and then, well, it says steals, or let me just say Esau says steals, right? But, we could argue about that. And then and then Genesis 27, where he absolutely steals his blessing, right? So, inheritance. So what does inheritance look like in the ancient world? So inheritance rights, just for the record, were not officially standardized in the ancient Near East. And it seemed to be dependent on the father. So the father had some leeway as to how they divvied out inheritance. In Israel, particularly, the firstborn of the womb was honored, right? So that would be whether it be the firstborn animals and certainly the firstborn sons, right? So the firstborn sons are honored, and generally the firstborn son inherited a double portion of the inheritance, okay? And this is going to be partly due to the fact that once the father dies and the firstborn son, once he gets the inheritance, he becomes in charge of the greater family, right? And so he takes care of, let's say, unwed females. If any business needs to be taken care of, he does all of those things. I guess, honestly, you could sort of kind of compare it to sometimes when you do a will and the executor of your will gets an extra 10% because they have to do specific things and all of that, and they have to deal with that. So it's kind of like that. I guess you could, obviously we're 3,000 years away, but so it's a similar idea, right? You get extra because you're doing extra. You have extra responsibilities and all of that. So in this case, Esau would be set to receive 2/3 of the inheritance, while Jacob would have gotten 1/3 of the inheritance. Daughters could also inherit, just for the record, but they would have to marry a man inside the family. So that way, the property and everything stays within the clan, right? And so you want to keep everything within the clan. And later, once the law is official, because keep in mind, we're reading all this in Genesis, the law is not official yet. We don't have the law of Moses yet because Moses hadn't come yet. And so later when we get to the law of Moses and we divide up the land, no, you can't even get rid of your land, right? And even if you can kind of get rid of it for a short period of time, you can sell parts of it off or whatever, but after so many years, it goes back to the original family. And in that way, that family never loses their land. There's always a home place for that family to come back to, and that's the point there. If you have nothing else, you have a home. It's kind of like, today, think about that. If you had your home paid for, right, no matter what your other bills are, if your home is paid for, you at least have that comfort, like, well, at least my home is paid for, right? So again, the birthright gives the double portion and makes you responsible for the family, right? And so it would be shocking for someone to give away their birthright, particularly for some stew, right? So this is just Esau is just a foolish guy, right? In many respects, and as we go through, we'll see how foolish he is. When he loses his birthright, just for the record, or gives it up, if you will, it would seem then that he only gives up the extra portion, right? So then he gets 1/3 of the inheritance, and then he's giving Jacob 2/3 of the inheritance. So even then, he's not giving away everything. So birthright versus blessing, right? So he gives away his birthright, but then Jacob just straight up steals his blessing, right? Along with his mother. His mother's involved. And at Genesis 27:36, it says, Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." Then he said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" Right? And notice it says there, "Is he not rightly named Jacob?" So that tells you, wait, there's something about the name Jacob. And again, it means deceiver, cheat, right? Cheater. And so he's appealing to that. And he's like, see, he's lived up to the expectations. So again, he clearly stole the blessing, but the birthright, I think that's pretty much, that's on Esau. So some will argue that there is no practical difference between the birthright and the blessing, right? And so it's basically the same thing. It's just he made a statement about it, and then it's officially taken away from him at the end. Others, however, argue that the birthright has to do with the material inheritance, while the blessing has to do with hopes for future prosperity, dominion over other nations, and status as the head of the clan, right? So think of the blessing as pertaining to the destiny of the one being blessed. So it's like, okay, the birthright gives you inheritance, but then the blessing helps set your destiny in a positive light, right? And so coming from the Father, it was an important thing. All right, so then we go through and we get to Esau's wives at Genesis 26:34-35 and 28:6-9. Note that he's married Hittite women, right? Hittites are actually from modern Turkey, so they're from considerably north of where we're talking about, but they would come down from the north and they would come down and they would settle in these areas, right? But they're still Hittites. And so whenever you have them listed, they are oftentimes listed among the Canaanites, because you have a situation where sometimes Canaanites in the Old Testament are like a specific people group, like they're Canaanites. But then other times they incorporate all kinds of other people groups. It's just like a generalization, Canaanites, but it could mean all kinds of different people. And so they're often listed, the Hittites are often listed among the Canaanites, right? Well, it is a big no-no throughout Israelite history, even before they're officially Israel, to marry Canaanites, because those are the people that we don't want to be like those people. After Esau finally figures out that he made an error in marrying 2 Hittite wives, 2 wives, keep in mind, he has 2 wives, he marries an Ishmaelite, which note that Ishmael, right, you had Isaac and Ishmael, and then Ishmael is sent away, right? And so now you have Esau going off and marrying an Ishmaelite. Well, the interesting thing about this is there's some irony in that, because you have Esau, who has effectively put himself out of the family of Abraham, right? Out of the family of Abraham, because he's given up his birthright. He clearly has no respect for family, and so he's put himself out. Well, then he goes and marries someone who was also put out of the family of Abraham, right? So it's just kind of an ironic little twist there. Of course, obviously, he's the son of Isaac, right? But he's in the family of Abraham. This whole scene shows, again, that Esau has no respect for family or covenant, right? So he isn't worthy of the covenant with God. And so that's why the covenant doesn't go through him. It goes through Jacob, because he has no respect for covenant. So Jacob, of course, has his own problems. And so, but at least and you find this interesting in the Bible, even David, right? So it says that David is a man after God's own heart. However, David did terrible things. Like, he pretty much did every bad thing that you could ever do. But he had redeeming qualities. He repented, first of all. He always repented when he did bad things, and he recognized that he had done badly. And so he would always repent. He would take his punishment, sometimes severe punishments, and he would take those and still worship God, right? And so, God uses people for different reasons, because again, what perfect people could God find to work through? None, right? And so God uses imperfect people. He sometimes uses people that are very imperfect. My favorite example is, think about Saul, right? In the New Testament, who becomes Paul, or his name Paul. And so here you have a guy who is persecuting Christians, right? He's wanting to go and kill them. And he's zealous for the law of God, right? That's the reason that he's willing to do that, because he says, hey, I'm Jewish, and these people are messing with my religion, and that's wrong, and I'm going to go after those people, right? And so what does God say? Does God say, I'm going to smite him? No, he says, that's the guy I need right there. That's the guy. I need a guy that's that zealous, that is willing to go as far as it takes for God, right? And so that's why he chooses Paul, right? So that's kind of the way God works. Sometimes we look and say, well, wow, those people are kind of far out. But you know what? There's no perfect people. So Jacob flees to Paddan Aram because the text says, and this is one of my favorite lines, it says, this is in Genesis 27:42. It says, but the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you, right? So it's like Esau's really upset about all this. And, he's lost his birthright. He's lost the blessing, and he's just down in the dumps. But he's like, you know what makes me happy? Thinking that I'm going to kill Jacob, right? And so it gets serious. And so she ends up losing her son, which is what she didn't. She was afraid that she was going to lose the blessing through Jacob. And she ends up losing him. She ends up losing him, right? Because he ends up having to go away. At this point, Isaac passes the covenant blessing on to Jacob. The covenant with God. Of course, that's not official until later on when God actually tells him. So then moving to Genesis 28, 10 through 22, where Jacob has a stairway to heaven. That's funny because just this morning, I had a student who had a Led Zeppelin shirt on. And I said, can you name one song off that album? Because I do it to them all the time when they come through and they have all these band t-shirts. And I'm like, can you name one song from that group? And they almost can never do it. And so I said, can you name one song by Led Zeppelin? And he was like, I don't know. And I was like, Stairway to Heaven. Like, how can you not know Stairway to Heaven? So, all right, at Genesis 28, 16 through 17, it says, then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So what does that mean, right? Well, first of all, some of your translations will say, like Jacob's ladder, right? It'll say a ladder to heaven. Well, note that the Hebrew word is sulam. And sulam means a rising series of steps or stones a stepped ramp, or a flight of steps. So I know that some of the older translations have ladder, but just for the record, this is going to be steps, not a ladder. This is sacred space. So he sees this area. He sees God on these stairs and angels going up. God's at the top. And the angels are coming to and fro, and they're going and being messengers, because that's what the word angel means, right? They're being messengers, back and forth from the heavenly realm to the earthly realm. Sacred space is a place where the ancients believed that there is a gateway between heaven and earth. And he says it right there, right? He says that that's what he thinks. So whenever a king, you were going to build a city, you would have the king would come through, and he would inquire of the deity concerning the location of such gates of heaven. And guess what he would build there? We talked about them last week. A ziggurat, right? A tower, a ziggurat. So again, that's what the Tower of Babel is it's that place that allows the God to come down and be amongst the people, right? And again, part of the deal is that God doesn't need a tower. You cannot frame God as one of these pagan deities. He's not like that. He is outside of creation. He doesn't need your ziggurat. He can come down and be amongst the people, which is exactly what he's doing when they're building the ziggurat. So the point here seems to show that Jacob has access to God. So God provides him with a stream that helps him to understand in ways that he understands, right? Because he lives in this world where, he believes these, special, sacred spaces are. And so God sends him a dream. And the point of the dream is to tell him that he has access to God. And the problem is he refuses to consult God. And so it's like, hey, I'm right here. And Jacob's like, nah, I got this, right? Notice that Jesus in the New Testament says something very similar. And he's talking about this type of understanding where he says at John 1:51, and he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And so the point there that Jesus is making is that he's the one who provides the access between man and God, right? So he provides that access, just like where Jacob saw these steps that would again provide him with access to God. And so it's a similar idea. But notice Jacob's response at Genesis 28:20 through 22. It says, then Jacob made a vow saying, and notice all the ifs, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, right? And notice it didn't say ifs, but the ifs are implied, right? And this stone, bless you, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth, right? So it sounds good if you just read the last part, but the first part is, well, if you'll do this, and if you'll do that, and this works out for me, and I don't find anything better to do, then you can be my God, right? I'll allow it. Well, it's not the way we approach God, right? He is dependent on himself. And then we get to the next part of the story where we go and stay with Uncle Laban. And we find that maybe it runs in the family because Uncle Laban, he's a wily one himself. And Jacob is humbled and gets a little taste of his own medicine, right? So let's talk about Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. So marriage in the ancient Near East and, of course, the Old Testament. Alrighty. Voices. I hear voices again. That's all right. Those came from outside my head, so that's good. All right, marriage in the ancient Near East and the Old Testament. So note that marriages were usually arranged by the parents, and contracts would be written. You know, we don't think of the ancient world that they had all these contracts. But it's funny, when you go into some of these old cities and stuff, most of their documents and stuff, it's clay tablets and such that you find. The vast majority, well, I won't say the vast majority, a lot of them are different contracts and things like that. So it's funny, you can go through and, I mean, you know, I'm a nerd, so sometimes I do this. You can go through and read like contracts from the ancient world, and you can even read like bills of sale. So where, you know, Ogah Buluk, you know, sells a cow to such and that. Well, they have records of all this, right? And it's just fascinating that that's there. And just for the record, that's the reason writing was invented in the first place. Not to write stories and stuff, but to keep records. Because they, you know, once people were making deals and stuff, they were like, you know what? How are we going to know who did what? And they're like, well, you know what? We'll invent writing. So they invented writing. They're usually arranged, but note that there are many weddings in the Old Testament which are not, the parents seem to have nothing to do with. Jacob being one of them, right? So Jacob, even though his parents send him away to, you know, to get married and everything, they don't pick the wife for him. So he goes and he finds Rachel and he picks her. So you have two exchanges of money. You have the marriage price or the bride price. The bride price was given to the bride's family, sometimes separated into a down payment and a final payment on consummation. The bride price seems to be in payment for the fact that the woman is no longer in the house, and so there is an economic loss for the family. So they pay that money to take up for that, right? Then you have the dowry. The dowry was given to the bride directly from her family, which served as her inheritance from her family. This inheritance would be kept in case the husband died or if he divorced her for some reason. It's kind of like an insurance policy. It's set aside for a future incident. If she needs it, she uses it. If not, then it would be inherited by her family. All right, so here's a major question that you want to know the answer to. How could Jacob have married Leah and not have known it, right? So it's like, so in Genesis 29, 21 through 30, notice they get married, they have a party. Actually, I think they have a party and then get married, which, hint, hint, spoiler alert. And then they consummate the marriage, and then he wakes up the next morning and he's like, who are you? Wait a minute, this is not what I expected. Right? So, it's a cautionary tale, ladies and gentlemen. Young man, cautionary tale. Note first, and we don't think of this in the ancient world, right? We think of course, or I always did, we think of the ancients as like us, you know. And, you know, we think of in some of the Islamic countries and stuff, you know, those people wear, cover their faces in veils and all this stuff, you know, and we think, well, how foreign is that, right? Well, I hate to tell you, but Leah would have had one of those whole veil things on too. She would have had her head covered all the way around. It would have covered the bottom part of her face. She would have been covered up, right? And I'm going to tell you, it's the same root well. The reason that it was that way is because men could not control themselves, no joke. And so if they saw any part of a woman, it was considered, something that they would lust after. And so therefore, women had to cover up, right? So it's like, okay, well, could just teach the men to, control themselves. And, I mean, who am I? So, but that's the reason, right? It explains also, just for the record, in Paul, even when you get to the New Testament, when women have to keep their heads covered and all of that, because men even looked at women's hair and they saw that as something to lust over. And so women had to cover their heads when they prayed and all of that. It was to keep men from being distracted during prayer. Sad but true. So she would have been veiled. It was also dark, of course, but then he was likely drunk. Notice that it says that Laban holds a feast, okay? The word in Hebrew behind feast is mishteh, and that specifically means a banquet with wine. and other iterations of that word. So like if you use it as a noun, you can use it as a verb, you can use it in different ways. The word clearly denotes the consumption of wine, right? So the story there tells you that at least he's been drinking. And so now it doesn't say specifically that he's drunk, but clearly there's some drinking going on there. Notice Jacob has many wives and children, okay? At Genesis 29:31 through 30:24. And the story itself has many comical elements about all his wives and this back and forth and that. Well, you take this slave and you take that slave and whatever. My favorite is Genesis 30:14 through 16. Where it says, in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. Okay, just for the record, this is illegal now. Okay, when in the United States particularly, well, in most states. When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night, right? So that sounds crazy, okay? Like, it's like, what in the world? What are these mandrakes? Like, they must be really, really tasty. Well, they actually served a purpose, and Rachel ends up getting herself in trouble. Because mandrakes, which just for the record, they're related to potatoes, they were used in fertility rites and magic, as they were a narcotic, right? They serve a narcotic purpose. And they also served as an aphrodisiac, right? So Rachel's point of getting them is to help her in her fertility with her husband. But then she gives Leah to her husband for the mandrakes, and then what happens? Leah ends up having a child and then another child. So she ends up two back up on her again because she ended up making this crazy deal with her. And so that's the point. That's the point of the mandrakes, is it's the aphrodisiac. And so they're trying to, get pregnant by Jacob and all this stuff. So Leah gets them, and Rachel wants them to help with her fertility, and it ends up being the opposite. It doesn't help her at all. It gives her competitor more children. All right, so what's this need for a large family, right? And I think, we can generally assume. But it was vital that families had children for survival, particularly male children. The infant mortality rate, I looked at several figures for the infant mortality rate during this time period, and they range from 40 to 60% of deaths. And this doesn't count, of course, that's for the children. It doesn't count the mothers who died in childbirth, because today, we have all kinds of medicine, and we can do a cesarean section. We can cut a woman open if there's a major issue with the child or the mother. And that sounds crazy, but it's a fairly routine thing, right? Like that's pretty safe. I don't think anybody goes, oh my gosh, I have to have a cesarean section. Some people probably maybe appreciate that. According to Mark Chavalis, who is an Old Testament scholar, he says that the average age of a person in Mesopotamia, which is the northern area all the way down to Sumer, but Israel would be in the same, they would be in the same time period, same deal, they intermingle, so same kind of deal. The average age of a person in Mesopotamia, counting infants, was between 35 and 40. So if you count the infant mortality rate, then, and you average all that out, then the average age of a person is 35 to 40. However, if you only count people who lived from 5 years or after, then the average life expectancy was between 65 and 70 years old. So once you hit 5, you're pretty much going to survive for a good long life, right? And note that we get that today. So, there's still problems with childbirth, right? There's all kinds of problems that can happen with the child that they may not, live on to, even to birth. And then, there's those years and, the first 5 or so years where they're more susceptible to sickness and things like that. Well, that's with our modern medicine. In the ancient time period, they didn't know. They would, do incantations and cut up some animals and read the entrails. And they're like, I don't know, eat some mandrakes or who knows, right? So who knows? And so it was, medicine was a lot different. So if you live past 5, you had a pretty good lifespan. It was a known practice throughout the ancient Near East to take servants as wives or concubines to have children. Because again, the goal is to have many male children. Note too that it is assumed that there were female children that aren't mentioned. Female children generally aren't mentioned because they're not, and again, this is not me saying this, this is what they believed in the ancient world. Females were not important, right? They weren't as important as male children. Generally, they're named if they're important. So for instance, remember Dinah. So Dinah was suddenly named. You suddenly have this sister, Dinah, and it's like, oh, well, that's because that tells you if there's a sister named, then she's probably going to have some important part to play later in the story. This is confirmed in Genesis 46 when it says that Leah had unnamed daughters. It says that she had many children, like, I want to say it was like, did it say 30 something? I don't know. I can't remember how many, but it was a lot of children. And the males are named and the females are not. It does seem, however, that Rachel only has the 2 children, right? So she only has Joseph and Benjamin. In chapter 46, it seems to imply that as well. All right, what is the deal? This is another question that you want to know the answer to. What is the deal with Jacob's white sheep and dark goats and the stick with the stripes on it? Okay, that's at Genesis 30, 31 through 43. So Jacob is attempting to breed the animals in the sight of striped branches because it would appear that it was believed that whatever the animals looked upon during breeding marked their offspring. He clearly believes that seeing the sticks during mating serves some purpose, right? But admittedly, just for the record, there is no evidence anywhere else of such a belief in the ancient world. In other words, you can't, a lot of this stuff, like all this, marriages and, children in the ancient Near East, we can look at other, Sumerian, we can look at Babylonian text, Assyrian text, Ugaritic text, we can look at all these different places, and we can read about their gods, we can read about their, exchange of, whatever properties and such. But this is one of those things that there's nothing like this anywhere else, as far as the specific things. So we don't know exactly, but that seems to be what he's going for. Note that he is still relying on his wit, regardless of how you look at it, and regardless of what he's trying to do. And it clearly seems to be some sort of ancient superstition. He's still trying to rely on his wit in order to get by. In reality, it's God who is prospering him all along. Note that even Laban says that to him. He recognizes it and he says, look, I don't want to let you go because I had a dream and God said, that, you're the reason that I'm doing so well with all these animals and stuff. So I don't want you to leave. I'd just soon you stay here. And so even Laban recognizes that, but Jacob refuses to go to God and ask for help or to thank him for help or anything like that. Note too that it says he is breeding strong animals with strong animals. Obviously that makes sense. And look, even in the ancient world, just for the record, they did not understand science and they certainly didn't understand genetics, but they could look and say, well, okay, we've got these striped animals and these striped animals, and wow, every time striped animals mate with striped animals, you get striped animals, and whenever you have a striped animal with a dark animal, then they're mixed or whatever it ends up being, right? And so they did certainly understand these types of things. And so he certainly would have known too that if you mix strong animals with strong animals, you're going to get strong animals. All right, then we go to Genesis 31, 19 through 35. This is after we have decided that we're going to leave, finally. And we don't want to tell Laban because Laban always seems to find a way to keep us here. And so we're going to leave. And it's funny because he goes to Rachel and Leah and he's like, hey, we need to go. Are y'all good with that? And they're like, we don't have anything here. Let's go. All right. And Rachel steals the household gods, okay, or the teraphim is the Hebrew word there. What's the purpose of idols in general, and how do they work? So idols to major gods were usually life-size. They're made of wood, they were hollow, and then they're usually covered in gold. Once the idol was complete, like you would have people who manufactured idols, and they would build this idol and cover it in gold and everything, the priest would whisper into its ear in what's called the opening or washing of the mouth ceremony. And what this would do is it would allow the deity, the god, to come into the idol, and then it would fill the inside hollow parts, and then it would allow for the organs and stuff to start working and beating and all of those different things. And so then the idol could actually function. So we see some of this in the Old Testament, where you see even with the Ark of the Covenant, right? I'm not saying the Ark of the Covenant's an idol, but I'm going to show you how that works. So a winner in battle, if you would go in and let's say you defeat another place, you would take their idol and you would take it back to your idol's temple. And what you're doing is you're taking control of their idol, because they believed in the ancient world that the god was more powerful in his own land, right? So, you see the God of Israel. So there's reasons that it's the God of Israel and the God of this and the God of that. And you have the God of Assyria and the gods of Babylon and all these different places. The gods of Egypt, right? Because they're more powerful, as the ancient people saw it, in their own homeland. And so you would go and take their idol and take it back to your homeland so that you could better defeat them, because their God's no longer there. We've taken it back to our place. So you get this in the story where the Philistines, and I thought I put it in here, but I did not. I know what it is, but I thought I had the verse. It's in 1 Samuel somewhere, okay? That's pretty specific, right? 1 Samuel somewhere?
Yeah.
So note that the Philistines, they steal the ark. And what do they do with it? The ark, note that the ark is the throne of God, and it represents the presence of God, okay?
Right.
So they take it, and they take it back to Dagon's temple. And so the point there is that we have your God, and we're going to hold him captive, and you've lost power. So then what happens? The next day they come in, and Dagon has fallen over, right? And so they're like, well, that's strange. So they take Dagon and they put Dagon back up, and then they leave, and then they come back the next day, and Dagon's head's chopped off and his hands are chopped off, right? So that's a pretty severe beating that Dagon has taken because of the ark. And what do? Do they say, well, there's no way. There's just no. They take the ark and they're like, we got to get this thing out of here. Like it's killing our God, right? So they take it out and they take it back, and they just drop it off at one of the Israelite camps. They're like, hey, we don't want this anymore. You just take it. And so again, that shows you're thinking of God, the Philistines. You Philistines are thinking of the God of Israel as though you can control him, or that he's like your pagan gods, when he's not. Yeah, take him back to your temple. Well, he's going to take out your God. So it didn't work the way they expected it to. It did not make him less powerful. Matter of fact, they took it to the temple and he ended up defeating their God. However, these household idols were small and represented the deceased relatives who bring health and well-being to the living relatives. Okay, so this is a different type of idol. They were passed down to the principal heir and were not given to a man outside of the family. So neither Jacob nor Rachel have any rights to these gods, or these idols, gods. They would have looked at them as gods. Women would adopt the gods of their husbands, so there's really no reason for her to have them, because once she goes and lives with her husband, she takes his household gods as her gods. It is possible that they had significance in terms of inheritance. So they might have had some help in decision-making with inheritance. And in that case, it may be that she's trying to force the inheritance to come to her, Rachel, instead of Leah, who of course would be the older daughter. And she would be there trying to get better for her children as opposed to Leah's children. Otherwise, it's possible that she was attempting to leverage those household gods in some way to win out over Leah. Those are the only things that really make sense. All right, then we'll move on to Genesis 32, 22 through 32, where Jacob wrestles with God. That's probably what your translation says. Note that it refers to the being as a man, right? But then Jacob refers to the man as an Elohim, right? So Elohim is actually a Hebrew word that's plural, and it's multiple gods. However, the God of Israel, when not using his proper name, sometimes he is referred to as Elohim, right? And so Elohim means God, or it can mean God. It can, of course, mean God's plural, but it can also mean a general divine being, or an angel, if you will, right? And note that Hosea 12:4 refers to the being specifically in that way as an angel. Hosea 12:4 says, he, meaning Jacob, strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He met God at Bethel, and there God spoke with us. So note that it says that there was an angel there. But then the angel, or the Elohim, as it says, speaks in the first person as God, right? It gives him the blessing. And it says, hey, I now bless you with... So what does that mean? Well, again, it's like I told you last week, this is another appearance of the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is either A, God himself in human form, or it is another divine being who has the authority to speak on behalf of God. So here you have that interchanging of angel and speaking as God, and so that's generally the way we refer to the angel of the Lord. It doesn't say the angel of the Lord here, but it does in other places, and it works the same way. So I always just argue it's God, and if it were me and I had to make a decision, I would say it's God in human form, right? So now then you say, well, does that mean he looks like Jesus, or what? It's God in human form, right? So however that works out for the future, or what he looks like, I mean, we can't know those things. Note that Jacob is 97 when he wrestles God. So he presents no physical challenge to this divine being. The wrestling match is ultimately a spiritual battle, as Jacob has been fighting between reliance on himself and reliance on God his whole life. When Jacob finally requires assurance that God will help him, this shows that he is broken and has turned his reliance to God, even though it might be his last resort, right? The fact that he's willing to try to force God means that he believes God can help him, and that's what he needs at this last ditch effort. Like, Esau's going to kill me because I did bad things to him, and so therefore the only thing I have left is to force God to help me. Well, that sounds terrible, but at least it means that he believes that God can help him, and it shows faith. Even though it might be somewhat the wrong way to look at it, it's faith. And it's at that point that he is then blessed, and God, blesses him. All right, so that's basically Jacob and Esau. I did want to go over, because it did cover, and listen, no matter what's in the weekly readings, I'm going to do 7 days at a time, right? So sometimes it may be awkward, because like right now I'm going to talk a little bit about Joseph going into slavery. Notice that Genesis 37, 26 through 27, this is when they've put him in the pit and they're going to kill him, Joseph. Again, Genesis 37, 26 through 27. They're going to kill him, right? But then they decide, and so they say this. It says, Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him. For he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. So they're like, you know what? It would be wrong to kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery. That's much better, right? So that's what they decide to do. One interesting thing here is that we can look at the price of slaves in the ancient world in this area, and we can see that slaves went for about 10 shekels in 2000 BC. We can see that slaves went for about 30 shekels in 1300 to 1200 BC. And so we know that Joseph went for 20 shekels. And so you can look back, and if you had no other information about when this took place, you can look and say, oh, well, that means that Joseph is somewhere in that in-between period. Most people would put him between 1800 and 1500 BC. So you can actually date him into a time period. And there are other places you can date the Old Testament, but that's just one of those markers that kind of verifies a time period. Note that they then soak his coat in blood, the coat that his father gave him. Just for the record, I know it's always the coat of many colors. The Hebrew behind that is uncertain. And so it is very possible that it's not a coat of many colors. It is a coat that has sleeves that go all the way to the wrist. But again, they don't really know exactly what that part that is usually translated as many colors, or some translations will say a long sleeve coat. I want to say that the New Living Translation does, but I don't know. I know the ESV says many colors. And they sent the robe at 37, 32 through 33. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It's my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Note again, Jacob is getting a taste of his own medicine. But because note that he tricked his father Isaac with animal skins to show that he was Esau in his little charade. And now his sons are tricking him with animal blood on Joseph's cloak or coat in order to trick him to make him believe that he's been killed by wild animals. So again, all right, Judah and Tamar at Genesis 38, 1 through 30. You get suddenly this story in here that kind of seems to jump out in the middle of nowhere. Note that we have what's called a Levirate marriage here. If there is no male heir, it is the responsibility of the brother or another close relative to have a child for his deceased brother or relative. Because you have the wife, you have the husband dies, the husband needs a male heir. So you go to the brother, the wife conceives a child with the brother. That child is not the brother's child. That child is the original husband's child at that point, legally, right? And so then, not only does the wife have someone to take care of her and to protect her, but then the deceased husband or your brother, he has his family line continues on as well. And again, this was important in the ancient world. Like, this was in utmost importance. And so that's a big deal. And it also provides for inheritance, right? Because you need the inheritance to continue through. And so you need that there. Note that her son will be considered Er's child, and being her husband, and would have had the birthright at that point. And this explains why Onan, the brother, doesn't want to give up a double portion of the inheritance, since now it doesn't go to Er's family at all. He gets the double portion. And so therefore, if he has a child with her, then he loses out on part of his inheritance. And so he says, I don't want to lose out on that. So that selfishness gets him killed. Though it goes against later Israelite law, which is again later, in the ancient Near East, if the brothers die or do not perform the duty, then the father-in-law must marry her. And that explains Tamar's thinking when she goes after Judah. Because she's like, well, if he's not going to give me any of his sons, then it's his job, right? And she probably knows that he's not going to agree to that. And so she goes and gets pregnant and has a child. All right, so some final notes again, as I'm just going to go through some fairly quick things. Note just quickly at Genesis 32, 1 through 2, you have these angels that show up before Jacob has this big meeting with Esau. And again, this is a similar experience to the Jacob's ladder situation, stairway to heaven, if you will. where you have angels, and again, they're showing him, you have access to God. Like, God will help you. And so he doesn't do that. And then, of course, God comes to he finally just comes and fights him, right? And he's like, okay, look, let's get this deal done. The raping of Dinah, which is that's Genesis 34, and it has major ramifications. But note that she would no longer be a virgin, which makes her practically unmarriable, right? And so, and again, it's not me saying this. This is the ancient Near East saying this. She would have been pretty much useless at that point. If she can't bear children, she would have seen herself as useless. If she can't bear children, then she has no use in the ancient world, right? That's the way that they would have looked at that. That's why you get all this strife with the women in Jacob's life, when they're like, oh, I can't have a child, and it's this, that. It's ever a fight to have children so that, you have heirs and such. Note that for her own economic welfare, as horrible as it seems to us today as moderns, marrying Shechem would have been the best possible thing for her, because at that point, she still would have had use in the eyes of the ancient world. She still could have had children and all of that, and so that would have been a benefit. Now, we would be horrified today to think in those terms, like that someone who's raped would marry the rapist. But back then, that would have been an option, and that's the option that they're going to go with. Note too, and it does not say that she is involved at all, but there are instances where people in the ancient world, couples would elope. And if you eloped and she got pregnant, well, at that point, the parents have to allow you to get married because, again, she's not going to be able to marry anybody else. And so you just make that decision yourself. You're like, you know what? They're not going to let us get married, so we'll elope, and then they'll have to let us get married, right? Bless you. It does not say that here. In other words, it gives no indication that she's involved in this plan. Note that God renews the covenant at Genesis 35, 9 through 13 with Jacob. Note that Joseph's dreams that he has about, the stalks and everything bowing and all of that stuff. Note that foreshadows, of course, what's going to come later on. And this whole ordeal with Joseph in Potiphar's house and prison and all of that. Note that he is blessed everywhere he goes, right? And so much of Joseph's story, well, really Joseph's whole story is to show the providence of God, where Joseph seems to be having all of these horrible things happen to him. And some of those things would be horrible. We can't take those things away. But they lead ultimately to Jacob and his family being protected in Egypt, and gets the whole family in Egypt to where we can then eventually get to Exodus, and then all of that happens. And then, of course, the Exodus being like the major event in Jewish, history. And so you see God's providence revealed throughout the story of Joseph. And we'll talk more about Joseph and Egypt and all of that stuff next week. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.